Is about the effects of biases when presented with evidence. First off, the man in the picture is Adolf Eichmann. He was a highly esteemed Nazi officer who served during the World War. He was convicted to trial on April 11, 1961, because of the atrocious things that he had done to the Jews. And since he had such a high ranking, this was a severe trial. And his trial sparked a lot of interest and was even televised internationally, which was a very big deal. And the reason this was such a big deal and had a lot of interest was because there were real life Holocaust survivors as testimonies during the trial in order to share their life stories and convince the judge that Adolf should be guilty. Adolf, in trying to defend himself, explained that he was merely a little cog in the machinery of destruction. What he meant by this is that since he wasn't the one in charge of running the Holocaust, since he was only given directions to do what he did, that he shouldn't be charged guilty because he was merely following instructions and that this was not his fault, according to him. But after the trial and after having heard all of the Holocaust survivors' testimonies and sharing their life stories and sharing how they had been affected, he was found guilty. Adolf was found guilty and was even sentenced to death. So throughout this situation, something we can see is bias. Bias is present throughout this situation because the Germans had a bias because they were siding with Adolf and wanting Adolf to be free and not guilty instead of siding with the Jews, and this was because of the fact that they were manipulated into thinking that the government was only trying to defend the people and the Germans by sending away the Jews, and they didn't really know the entirety of the story, and they didn't really know what was happening with these Jews in these concentration camps. Many people only thought that they were being resettled and that this was in order to free land and in order to boost the economy for the Germans, and this is why they sided with Adolf instead of the Jews. And when they were provided with this information, that the Jews were actually mistreated, they refused to believe it because of the fact that they had already been brainwashed into thinking that it was something done in order to help the people and to help the country. Another thing that was present throughout the RLS is evidence. And evidence was present because one form of evidence in the trial was the testimonies that were given by the Holocaust survivors and how they shared their life stories in order to provide evidence of why Adolf was guilty and of why Adolf should be punished. And this is something, evidence is a big thing because it can be interpreted in many different ways. Some people interpreted these life stories as an exaggeration and they wouldn't really accept them, but other people saw these life stories and saw what was really happening for the first time with Germany and had sympathy for them, and this is why they supported the Jews. So from these concepts came this knowledge question, which is how can our biases affect how we interpret evidence? And from this knowledge question comes different theories that support it and that helped build a bigger argument. For example, with confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when a person decides to ignore other evidence and information that is given to them because they are already set and have a mindset on what they believe in, and so they refuse to let in new ideas, which is what leads them to only focus on information that supports their way of thinking, and they decide to ignore any other information that may arise. And this is something that is present throughout the situation with Adolf, because the Germans supported Adolf because they were manipulated into believing that Jews were bad people and that the government was merely trying to help the Germans, and this is why they sent off the Jews, and they didn't really know that the Jews were actually being harmed and were actually having this poor life, because they thought that they were being resettled and that they were bad people and so they had to be sent away, or that the government was just trying to help. And so they didn't believe the harm that was actually going on, which is why they decided to ignore when the trial came up. They ignored these stories and these testimonies because they were strongly believed that the government did what they had to do, and that everything was fine. But around the world, people did not agree with this because they heard these testimonies and they heard what the life stories of these Jews, and so they were able to understand the whole situation and what was happening with Germany. Another theory that comes up from the knowledge question is with researcher bias. Researcher bias happens when a scientist or a researcher unconsciously changes their results because of a desired outcome. So, this happens with studies when people have a desired outcome and have this need for something to work out. They decide to change their results unconsciously, and they may focus more and put more attention towards an outcome in order for it to come true, even if the results aren't accurate, because this is what they truly desire and they want their studies to be as right as possible. And we can see researcher bias throughout the study because a famous psychologist who was named Milgram believed that and supported Adolf because he believed that Adolf only acted the way he did because he was being ordered around by his superior officers, and he was only following instructions, and that he actually did nothing wrong because he believed that when a person was faced with a superior officer ordering you to do something, that you had to do it no matter what because it's in humans' nature. And so he created this study, and in order to prove this, and in order to show that, because he wanted to prove that Adolf was guilty, so he created this study. And but there was researcher bias in this because we can see that Milgram told his participants that the people who they were supposedly harming, he told them that they were fine and that nothing was wrong with them and that they should proceed because nothing was wrong, but they couldn't actually see the person. But Adolf, who was creating these punishments during the Holocaust, he clearly did know that people were not fine, and he was able to see the Jews, and he was able to see the malnourishment, and he was able to see how people died, and he was able to see how people were mistreated, and so he was not blindly believing someone that they were fine because he clearly knew firsthand that they were not fine, which is where we can see researcher bias because Milgram had this bias that he believed that Adolf was innocent. And we can see this in different studies. For example, we can see in a case study that was done in order to test whether or not scientists tend to have biases when it comes to new findings. And the scientists were giving two treatments. A new treatment that had new research and didn't really have enough research, but it was new and had promise, or an old treatment that had a lot of research that backed it up, but if the new treatment would have been reliable, the new treatment would have been better. And most participants chose the new treatment even though there was not enough information to back this up, because they wanted to choose the new treatment because it showed more potential, and they wanted to have this new and innovative treatment that would make them better scientists and would bring up their careers. And so this is what led them to focusing on the research of the new treatment, because they had these biases where they had this desire for an outcome, and they decided to ignore the rest of the information in order to pursue this desired outcome. We can also see this a with a forensic science event that happened where there was a woman who was named Kathy Woods, who was wrongfully convicted of murder because she was accused of slitting the throat of a 19-year-old girl. But with DNA evidence, it was later discovered that Kathy was not actually the culprit and she was wrongfully sentenced to prison. But this was not until many years later, and she was actually sent to prison. And the reason this happened was because officials didn't really thoroughly investigate the case, and because they were in such a rush to find a culprit to culprit for the victim and the victim's family, they rushed their evidence and they based the case on their own opinions and their perception of the evidence. So them being biased and wanting this desired outcome and wanting to find someone to call guilty, they interpreted the evidence incorrectly, and this is what led an innocent woman to be in prison. And in conclusion, we can see that the knowledge question has deep significance because it allows people to realize how their judgment towards the world is being influenced by their biases. And this is something we can see through the use of the various real life situations that were given throughout the presentation. And these situations give us evidence of moments where our biases impact how we interpret evidence. And these are the works cited that were used.